Well, thank you all for the opportunity to speak before you here. And I don't get out to Texas very often, and it's very interesting to see the state. Now, with regard to media and alternative media, it means very different things to very different people. It seems to me in the last few years especially, so much of the media landscape has become dominated by social media. Facebook, Twitter, things like that. And strangely enough, I'm not really involved that much in that sector of the media. I've never really been able to get into Twitter. It seems when I sometimes went on some of the Twitter threads, given the character limit, they were mostly filled with slogans and insults. And it just seemed to me not the sort of thing I found very interesting. I come from more of a sort of academic or technical background. And obviously, Twitter is very useful and has always been very useful as a means of sort of publicizing longer, more thoughtful articles. And we send out tweets about the articles that we publish, and obviously many of our authors do as well. But as a content form, I don't really know how useful it is. In other words, it seems to me it's probably good at promoting certain messages and promoting certain ideas. But I really wonder how many people have ever had their minds shifted, their views dramatically changed by reading a 140-character tweet. Probably not that many. Now, Facebook obviously is much longer content oriented. And, it seems to me the problem there is that so many of the Facebook circles are so narrow and closed. You obviously have your Facebook friends, you have the people who are interested in that sort of thing, and probably they share certain interests. But in terms of reaching people of radically different perspectives and trying to shift their minds, I'm not really sure how effective it is. And, I have to admit, I haven't really used Facebook much myself, so maybe I'm missing something there. Though, given the last 6 months or a year and a half, and the crackdown on ideologically divergent tweet people and Facebook people, it seems to me whatever opening there was is now starting to close down again. And it seems to me one of the most horrifying aspects of the situation is that from what I've read in the newspapers, some of those tech giants are starting to censor or ban people, not even for what they said on that social media forum, not for what they tweeted, not for what they put on Facebook, but for what they wrote elsewhere, which obviously adds an element of self-censorship. In other words, if somebody is heavily invested in all of their followers, all of their Facebook friends, and if they know they could be banned if they said something that was contrary to ruling ideas on just an ordinary website, or if they wrote an article, it really makes you wonder how much they trim their sails and are much more cautious in what they say. So, as I said, I'm not really into those forms of new media. My perspective is that, when you're talking about shifting people's ideas, it's very difficult to get people to shift their ideological perspectives if you approach them from a different ideological viewpoint. In other words, if somebody is a hardcore believer in the effectiveness of government programs, and if you approach them from a strong libertarian ideological perspective, I think they'll probably just ignore you 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100. So a lot of the work I've done over the years has focused more on technical issues. In other words, quantitative issues, historical issues, simply trying to work out what the numbers are on certain questions. And if the numbers are what they are, many times, regardless of someone's ideology, they can expect, they can look at your facts, they can look at your details, they can see that you're correct. And then if they're surprised by some of the technical findings you can present to them, it then makes their ideological perspective much more malleable. And the nice thing about that is that that allows you sometimes to get into the minds of the mainstream media, which I think is really critical sometimes. Because when we're talking about all of these alternative media websites, many of them have a lot of traffic. Our website has a lot of traffic. Lou Rockwell obviously has a lot of traffic. A lot of these other websites, antiwar.com, has traffic. But when you compare that total traffic to what's produced by the mainstream media, the electronic media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, it's really just a sliver. And so, at least at this stage of the world situation, the most effective way of shifting broader perspectives is to reach and shift the perspectives of some of the people in the mainstream media. And in fact, what I was going to talk a bit about is some of the areas where I think I've had the most success over the last, say, 8 or 10 years in dealing with these sort of controversial issues that are many times ignored or, treated nervously by elements of the mainstream media. And since they won't go into those issues, it gives people in the alternative media an opening to go there and do some analysis. Like one thing that really worked out very well about 7 or 8 years ago, and it's become hot again today, obviously, with the current political campaign in the last couple of years, has been the issue of immigration. Immigration is really a hot button issue. Every few years it comes back again. And there are a lot of different perspectives you can provide on the immigration issue. A lot of different viewpoints. It's a bitter issue. But one of the things that seems to attract the strongest emotions by many of the people involved is the question of crime. In other words, immigration, Hispanic immigration, is heavily associated with crime in the popular mind. And to be honest, I live in California, the large immigrant population. I've lived in other places that have had large immigrant population, New York City, when I lived there a few years. And I simply never really seen that in my own day-to-day life. In other words, when I lived in New York City, Jackson Heights, New York, heavily immigrant, and there didn't really seem to be all that much crime. Same thing in California. And so about 8 or 9 years ago, I decided to just sit down and do some detailed analysis on the crime issue. Now, the funny thing about it is I think many people in the mainstream media tend to be very skittish, or mainstream academia, to approach this because they think their opponents probably are right. In other words, the mainstream establishment perspective tends to be very pro-immigrant. But I had the distinct sense that many of them probably believe that, well, immigrants probably do commit a lot of crime, and that's the reason we won't investigate it at all. And I just sat down and did some very simple calculations. Imprisonment rates, public statistics, government incarceration rates, crime rates in cities when you connect the population of the cities with the demographic issues of how heavily those cities are Latino, how heavily they're immigrant, cross-correlation analyses, all of these different results, they all converged on a very simple and shocking to many people statistic, which is, leave aside, for example, Asian immigrants. Most people have the perception that Asian immigrants don't commit much crime, but it's Latinos coming across the border to rape and rob and kill. And when you really look at the actual data, government statistics having no ambiguity involved, including homicide rates where reporting is very high, what you see is that Hispanics, Latinos in the United States, who are obviously very heavily immigrant, they have crime rates, when you adjust for age, that are very similar to those of whites in the United States. In fact, those cities in the United States that have the heaviest Latino population, El Paso being a perfect example, have some of the lowest crime rates in America. And that's true in California. You have Anaheim, you have Santa Ana, very heavily immigrant. I mean, Santa Ana is, I believe, 75% Latino, very heavily immigrant, the most heavily immigrant Latino city in America. And it has low crime rates in California. And, you can look at the same data from several different ways: incarceration statistics, urban demographics, cross-correlation analysis, and you all get the same result. Now, what confuses people is that Latinos, for example, are much younger than the general population. So, for example, the average white in America is in the mid to early 40s. and the average Latino tends to be in the mid to late 20s. Now, the truth is, people in their 20s normally commit a lot more crime than people in their 40s and 50s. And so that, obviously affects the statistics. But when you adjust for age, the crime rates are very similar. And in fact, I'm proud to say that when I put that article out, partly because that article confirmed what so much of the mainstream establishment would like to believe is true, but have been too scared to research themselves because they thought probably they'd get the wrong answer. When I put it out, it got a lot of attention, including the mainstream media. And even years later now, when you Google, for example, Hispanic crime, Latino crime, simple words like that, you get tens of millions of web pages back. And that article of mine from a few years ago is still generally very close to the top, on the first page of tens of millions of websites. Now, the truth is, as you see from the current political debate, ideas can be put out there, they can get a lot of currency, they can get a lot of websites, and many times people don't really recognize the reality of it. And in fact, one unfortunate aspect of the situation is that people in California, which is very heavily Latino, 40% Latino, more than the white population, they know perfectly well this is true. And that includes the people in the tech companies. For example, Palo Alto, where I live, is the home of some of the key tech executives. The Facebook CEO lives there, Apple CEO lives there, a lot of Google people live there. And it's right next to East Palo Alto. When I moved back to California, when I moved to Palo Alto in the early 1990s, East Palo Alto was a horrible area. It had the highest per capita murder rate in America, higher than Detroit, higher than DC. It was a very dangerous place. It made a lot of people nervous. And then there was a vast flood of Latino immigrants moving into the area. And since that time, in the 25 years, the East Palo Alto murder rate has dropped by 97%. It's a very safe area these days, and it's overwhelmingly Latino immigrant. Now, when CEOs living right next door are perfectly aware of what's happened, and when they look around their area and see that immigrants have low crime rates, and when certain political leaders say something that's very different than that, or certain, for example, politicians say something very different from that, it weakens their credibility in the minds of these tech executives. And unfortunately, that has been one of the factors, I think, involved in a lot of the censoring that's been going on in the tech industry. In other words, the people who run these platforms, when they see people saying sort of crazy things, they say, oh, there's a crazy people, we can't have crazy people on the internet, let's ban them. So, things like that have both positive and negative results, but, I think it's important that we stand for truth and that we show people what the reality of the world is. Because regardless of your ideological perspective, you can't make good policy decisions unless you have solid facts to go on. Now, another thing I've been involved in, which may end up working out very well, even in the next few weeks, we'll find out, is the whole question of, for example, unfair, racially biased admissions policies in universities. I've been always opposed to affirmative action in college admissions. In fact, probably more than anything else, it was what shifted me into the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan. I, came from a family of liberal Democrats. I just thought it was a very unfair system. And the system really had been going on for decades. And then basically about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided really to take a closer look at some of the data and investigate it in a way that really other people had not done. And what I really discovered, to my shock, was how severe some of these discriminatory policies were in ways that were very apparent because they related, for example, to the Asian American population. And what really people had not focused on is that when you look at, for example, the elite universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the other Ivy League schools, there'd been a lot of talk going around, suspicions, rumors, word of mouth, that those universities sharply discriminated against Asian students based on their racial background, which, is exactly opposite to what all these universities claim to be. They claim to be very non-racial. And people had seen, for example, that, the numbers didn't seem to be moving up much. They seemed to be pretty stable. What they hadn't focused on is that there had been a huge rise during exactly that period in the Asian American population. Over a 25-year period, the number of Asian American high school students in the United States had almost doubled as a fraction of the high school population, a huge rise in Asian American student numbers. By all standards, academic testing and everything like that, it was clear that they were doing very well academically. High test scores, doing very well in difficult academic competitions, studying very hard. And all of these universities were showing almost no change in the admission numbers of these groups. Furthermore, when I plotted it out on a graph, it really was a shocking graph. What it showed was that all of these different universities in the Ivy League during a period of about 20, 25 years had all converged to almost a single percentage rate of Asian American students. In other words, some of them had started with a higher number, some of them started lower number, and then over a period of about 25 years, they moved to become almost exactly around 18, 19, 20%. And graphically, it was a very telling figure, especially because that figure diverged so totally from the growth of the Asian American population. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but about 20 years ago, there was a very good book that came out by a Wall Street Journal reporter, Daniel Golden. It was called The Price of Admission. And it focused on the incredibly corrupt and dishonest admission practices that most of these universities followed, not just with regard to affirmative action, not just with regard to racial discrimination, but with regard to outright corruption. In other words, selling places at these top universities in return for large financial donations. And in some cases, strong rumors, strong suspicions that the admissions officers were actually taking personal bribes to get students admitted. I mean, it's really, when I started looking into it, it was shocking. I mean, it's unbelievable, but the average admissions officer at many of these elite schools is very poorly paid. They earn less than public school teachers. I mean, in some cases, their background, for example, at a top school, when I was reading through one of these books, one of the top admissions officers had previously been involved in animal control. He was a dog catcher. Another one, for example, had been a welfare screener. He was screening recipients of food stamps. Another one had run a camera store. And in some cases, they lost their jobs, so they had to settle for a less paid job, which was basically deciding who gets admitted to the most elite universities in the United States. And when you have an entirely opaque, secretive system that has a strong subjective element, where these very valuable goods are being allocated by very poorly paid individuals who don't, in most cases, have much of an academic background, can you think of a better opportunity for corruption? Imagine, for example, if the government officials who could allocate incredibly valuable goods could do so entirely based on their own subjective views. Oh, I like that guy. He had a good essay. And they were poorly paid, and those goods were very, very valuable. I mean, it's absolutely designed for corruption. And, the truth is, when you look at the results of it, you see a tremendous amount of corruption in the system, even at the best schools. And as I said in a long article I wrote on that subject, when you pick America's ruling elites, because the truth is, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, more and more of America's ruling elites are being selected from the narrow group of the students who attend these top universities. They're the ones who basically get the great jobs on Wall Street. They get the great jobs in Silicon Valley in some cases. I mean, it's a much less broader meritocratic system than we used to have a couple of generations ago. And when you pick the next generation of America's ruling elites based on a very corrupt system, what you end up with is corrupt ruling elites. And over the last generation or so, when we see what's happened with our financial system, when we see what's happened with our political system, I think there's a strong element of that involved. And so when I was able to come up with those results, really remarkable quantitative results that nobody really could argue with, they end up getting some nice attention, even the New York Times, other elite media publications. And about a year after that, a group of Asian American students and the organizations that they were involved in decided they'd had enough. They were going to launch a lawsuit based on that. And now, 5 or 6 years later, that lawsuit right now has gotten to Boston Federal Court. They've been suing Harvard. The discovery process has come out and it showed, I mean, these admissions officers talking about basically if that family that gave them money in the past might be giving them more money in the future, that determines whether they admit the student. Oh, that family has an art collection. Maybe we can get them to give us our art collection if we admit, their son or daughter. I mean, it's as bad as the sale of indulgences by the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. And it's all coming out through the discovery process, and there's a chance, I don't know what the odds are, but there's a reasonable chance that in the next few weeks, a Boston federal judge will rule against Harvard's long-standing system of racially based admissions. Not only that, but it even goes broader than that, because obviously the key Supreme Court decision was the Bakke decision. It was, I guess by now, about 40 years ago. In the Bakke decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of taking race and racial factors into account in admissions policies. And the reason they ruled in that favor was that the president of Harvard and the president of Princeton filed briefs in the Bakke case that stated Harvard and Princeton, these top universities, are able to ensure diversity without any use of racial quotas. We don't have racial quotas. We oppose racial quotas. We don't need it. And therefore, the Supreme Court signed off on the notion of, quote, racial diversity, whatever that means and whatever it's come to mean. Now, the interesting thing is, if this federal judge in Boston rules that Harvard has been using racial quotas on Asians all of these years, that proves that the Bakke decision was decided based on fraud. It was fraudulent filing by Harvard University that helped that decision take place. And that might open a lot of changes on the federal level with these issues. So, let's keep our fingers crossed. And obviously, whatever the decision is in Boston court, it'll certainly be appealed. It might get up to the Supreme Court. We'll see what would happen. But once you can come out with solid statistics, factual evidence, there are probably a lot of people who've sort of vaguely supported affirmative action all of these years and supported it from the ideological perspective. But they said to themselves, well, it doesn't really mean quotas. And when you can show them quantitative, ironclad evidence that even at the most elite universities that swore up and down that they didn't have quotas, they actually do have quotas and have had quotas all of these years, changing somebody's mind about a key factual matter sometimes then causes them to reassess their entire ideological framework. And getting it into the mainstream media, causing reporters to start questioning so many of the things they believed, I think can have a very positive result. So what we've tried to do on the website and other publications I've been involved in the past is use the fact that the mainstream media is so unwilling to seriously explore certain issues because those issues are too controversial, those issues are too touchy. It provides an opening for the alternative media to get involved in those issues, and involved in a very serious way, involved with factual details, and under the right circumstances, every now and then, every few years, finding results that are so persuasive that the mainstream media will actually take them seriously. And if they take them seriously, then, broader changes can take place.